to Tales of Cape Cod and our 1763 old colonial courthouse. I'm Ann Kennedy, a board member, and I welcome you here. And our speaker tonight is Christy Palmer Lawrence, the author of the first complete biography of Thornton W. Burgess, a 20th century Cape Cod native, naturalist, conservationist, and children's author. Christy received her BA in English from Hobart and William Smith Colleges and an MA in professional writing from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. She has been a freelance writer and an editor for 30 years and has taught writing at Cape Cod Community College, University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, and at the Cape Cod Writers Conference. She is a former board member of Greenbrier Nature Center. Is there anyone here from Greenbrier tonight? Welcome. And she currently resides in the former home of Thornton Burgess. So please, please welcome Christy Palmer Lawrence.
Thank you, Ann. Thanks, everybody. And let's make sure, first of all, is the volume okay? What do we think? Okay. Yeah, thanks, everybody. And I understand at least one person is here for the dessert. Anyone else? Excellent, excellent. I can see it from here. You made a good choice. I'd also like to thank the sponsors. I truly appreciate this grand opportunity to be here in this wonderful building and to talk about one of my favorite subjects. We can see here, I wanted to have this letter up by Dr. Theodore Reed for you to have a chance to look over it. That's a pretty powerful start in the realm of wildlife conservation and natural history, one name in the United States that must not be forgotten. That's pretty powerful, and I like starting off that way. Dr. Reed lays out very nicely the legacy of Burgess, that he was important to conservation, to education, and that his efforts began long before the nature movement in the second half of the 20th century. He was advocating for nature and for wildlife education in the teens, in the 20s. And I'll go into his role a bit more. His purpose was always to enlighten children. It's one thing I admire as a writer myself. Burgess did not use children as a stepping stone. They were his audience, and he maintained that focus on children for his entire lifetime. And fourth, Reed says that we're indebted to Thornton Burgess for the impact that he had. It's hard to underestimate the scope of that, but I'll just tell you that when I was researching this book, which took 4.5 years, I came on the statement that in 1919 he was honored for his impact on millions of children. And as a journalist and a writer, I thought, okay, well, it sounds like a bit of an exaggeration. We'll see about that. And by the time I was halfway through the research, I thought, that's extremely conservative. This man's books, half of them are still in print today. And I'll lay out for you why his work is so particularly important. Yeah, let's get oriented here. Burgess was born in 1874 here on Cape Cod. He died in 1965. And I like to point out that he died 9 years after the end of the Civil War and the assassination of Lincoln. He was born, and he died in 1965, the year after Kennedy was assassinated. So he lived a very long, very productive life, but that these two assassinations, so critical to American history, bookend his life, I think is quite interesting. He authored 70 books, and if you're thinking, well, I thought I've seen 170, yes, you have, but what defines a book, that category varies. And so what we can consider a book, I went with the figure of 70. He authored 15,000 syndicated newspaper columns. The last one came out when he was 87. If any of you are writers and you've had 1,000 articles written, you're probably thinking you're pretty spectacular, and you are, of course. 15,000 is staggering, and it's a testimony to the work ethic and the dedication of Thornton Burgess. Pioneer environmental educator, we'll get into that a bit more, but as I said, his focus was teaching children to love nature, to understand the ways of nature. Who else was doing that in the 19-teens and the 20s and the 30s? Who was focusing on children in that way? He was also nationally an influential conservationist. A lot of people don't realize the role that he was playing. He was a pioneer in early radio. I don't get into that quite as much as I probably should, if any of you are interested in his radio role. But there's a wonderful book, Science in the Air, by Marcelle Affoletta, a Smithsonian researcher, Science on the Air, and she has a full chapter on Thornton Burgess. She told me that his program, his nature program for children was probably the first one ever for children. It began in 1924. Fables of the Green Forest. Have any of you heard of this? Burgess, in 1973, there was a program in Japan where 20 of his books had been translated. In Japan, children were watching Yamanazumi Rocky Chuck on television once a week, all year long. So children here reading Thornton Burgess stories, children in Japan reading Thornton Burgess books, and also watching the cartoon. And in 1979, there was the cartoon was taken by Ziv International and distributed as a children's television cartoon based on Burgess books. And his name is included. Whatever the language is, whether it's Spanish or French or Italian, you will see Thornton Burgess crop up there somewhere. He was, in fact, nature's ambassador to generations of children and adults. And the adults factor in as much. The adults are reading the stories. The adults are listening to the radio program. The adults are being educated in the same way that the children were. From 1910 to the present, as I said, half of Thornton Burgess's books are still in print. So a lot of times people wonder where a title of a book comes from. And my biography on Thornton Burgess, I had one lined up, but I thought, if the perfect one comes along, I'm going to know it. So I found an old piece of paper that had a copy of this pictorial review, Burgess's article, Writing 7,000 Articles. And as I read along, I came upon, I would rather write for and talk to children than be a best-selling novelist, for the child mind is open, and it receives truth without question. And I would rather be Mother Nature's ambassador. Stop. There it was. The title of the biography, Nature's Ambassador. And indeed, Thornton Burgess was. This is the man we're talking about. This is Thornton Burgess, probably midlife. I believe this setting would be his house in Hamden. Where's the person from? Aha! Yes. So you've probably been in this very house. Yeah. This is Burgess looking comfortable, probably posing. You can see it's 1940. As I said, he lived a very long life, and I was shocked to come across in my research a letter that Thornton Burgess had written to a friend of his lamenting the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So again, that he was born in the era that people around him were talking about the Civil War. It gives perspective on this life. This is This is the birthplace. Let's see if I can do this little thing here. That's it. That's his birthplace, and that's my house. Number 6 School Street. I've lived there for 40 years. Burgess lived there for a much shorter period of time. He was born in the house in 1874. But, oh, and I wanted to mention too, and we'll move on, but living in the birthplace of my subject, I was in an interesting position. My office is downstairs to the left, and I could look through the window looking up School Street, and there's a vacant lot across the street. And in that vacant lot, at one point, was the school that Thornton Burgess had gone to, and the casino where he had regaled the townspeople with as a keynote speaker for a major event in the 1930s. So I was, in a very significant way, walking in his footsteps. And it was an interesting experience, I can tell you. This is his mother, Caroline Burgess. She was the most influential person in her life. She was his rock, his inspiration. Those of you who've read the books know of the couplets that are at the head of many of the chapters, and they really expressed his mother's philosophy of life. She was a very powerful influence on him. This is Thornton Burgess's father, Thornton Waldo Burgess Sr. He never met him. Thornton Sr. died when his son was just 11 months old. He was 24, and Caroline at that time was 22. And again, it's an interesting situation to be living literally so close to the subject. And I'd been working on this book for quite a while when suddenly it hit me that Caroline Burgess, at the age of 22, had walked through my front door, across my threshold, carrying her baby, carrying Thornton Burgess, grieving, having just lost her husband of 24 years. And what was she going to do? She had to cope in the way that, so many people have had to cope. She relied on the family, and both she and her husband had a lot of family in town. So if you know the Thornton Burgess story, many of you are familiar with it, Thornton Burgess lived in 10 houses in the town of Sandwich. We know that. Again, it's another thing to go a little deeper on that and think about that. If your childhood consisted of moving into 10 different spaces. And this is Main Street. These children are standing there. They would be looking down the street towards the Daniel Webster, and behind them is Main Street going towards the Masonic Hall. So they're kind of right in the middle of Main Street, sort of in the middle section there of the town, if you're familiar with it. And we're looking, our eyes, we're not looking at the houses, but we're looking past probably 6 of the houses that Thornton Burgess lived in right along here. And again, this is my neighborhood, so I walk my dogs, and it brought an intimacy to the writing of this story that was extremely interesting, very valuable. The thing that Thornton Burgess always said about Sandwich, this is a place he was quite familiar with. This was a boardwalk, and in his autobiography, which I recommend if you're a Burgess fan, it's an excellent book, he describes going across the boardwalk, which had been built the year after he was born, walking across this boardwalk to see a giant blue whale that had washed up on the beach. But this is the little boy who grew up in Sandwich and was a proud Cape Codder. Thornton Burgess always identified himself as a Cape Codder, and a proud descendant of Thomas Burgess, who was one of the founders of Sandwich. I came to have an understanding, I think, of how Burgess developed his unique sense of ecosystem. One of the things that's remarkable, and those of you who are Burgess fans sitting here, you can be thinking back on this, how he could relate the total environment, the birds in the air watching the mammals on the ground thinking about the nests of the birds around them. Burgess wrote about the interactions of nature with his stories. And he said that this understanding, this love of nature came in Sandwich when he was a boy. And one of the reasons that he became familiar with nature, he had to help his mother. Financially, it was a desperate situation. So if he could pick blueberries or blackberries or anything like that, he helped his mother in that way. And often he was afield, as he would say. He used that word. But he also developed a sense of what the poet Nikki Giovanni refers to as ordinary prudence. And that means awareness of what's around you. It's a mindfulness. Burgess had this to, I think, an unusual degree. And it was because this child grew up in 10 different houses. He didn't have his own house or his own room or his own yard. It was always borrowed, and he had to develop an awareness. And I believe, personally, I've never seen anything in writing on this, but I think that translated for him into the stories that he was writing. So this is Burgess the little boy, and this is Burgess the young man who left Sandwich looking for work. He desperately wanted a college education, and of course there was no hope of that. His grandfather gave him 1 year, a very practical grandfather, 1 year in accounting school, and he loathed it. Thornton Burgess hated that, but it was a means of supporting himself. Excuse me. Which was important. Excuse me just a sec. Sorry. Be thinking of questions. Sorry. So he worked as an accountant, but he knew he wanted to write. He knew he wanted to be a writer and a journalist. And his mother telegrammed him one day and said, "There is an opportunity here in Springfield. I want you to come and interview for this job." And it was a torment to Thornton Burgess because he was established in Boston at that time. He was working as an accountant. He had friends. He had a place to live. He was doing well. He was in his early 20s. Things were okay. And what his mother was proposing to him was that he give all of this up, all the security up, and go take a job as an office boy, which meant he would be sweeping floors and dusting off journalists' desks. It was way beneath him. But this is typical of Thornton Burgess. He realized that this, yes, it didn't suit, but it got him where he wanted to go. It was the ladder that he wanted to be on. Yes, he was the lowest rung, but it was the ladder. And he made that type of decision. I grew as a writer myself, more and more to admire and appreciate his thinking, his practicality, and his courage. So when he was working, he took that job. When he was working in Springfield, he met this lovely young woman, Nina Osborne. They married. 400 people came to his wedding in 1905. And Burgess was a professional journalist as well as a writer, and he has some marvelous photos, but this one kind of captivates me. I hope you like it too. I just think it's so intriguing. And the next one, this is Burgess's photograph of their honeymoon. Obviously Nina liked nature too, and was enthusiastic about camping in the Adirondacks. So, unfortunately, tragically actually, not unfortunately, Nina, they were married in 05, June 05. And she gave birth to their son, Thornton W. Burgess III, the next year, and she died that day. And so, yes, absolutely. And having read Burgess's journals, you are struck with the sorrow, the depth of his sorrow. So your sighs are well expressed. It was a tragedy, and yet, again, what was he to do? He had a son, he had his mother to support, and himself. He had to rally. He had no choice. So he went on, continued working, and then in 1911, this is a picture of Fanny Johnson. He remarried. Fanny Johnson was 39 at the time, Burgess 37. Obviously, this is later, but she was a huge help to him in his writing of stories. And at the time that Burgess married Nina, he was a journalist. He hadn't written any children's books and had no intention of doing it at that point. But Fanny had 2 teenagers. And so with marriage, Thornton Burgess had his son, his mother, himself, his new wife, and her 2 children to support. And 2 months after he married, he came to work. He had an excellent job with Phelps Publishing. I don't think I mentioned that name, Phelps Publishing in Springfield. And he was an editor at Good Housekeeping, doing extremely well. Monday morning, note on his desk, your services are no longer needed. You have 2 weeks. Good Housekeeping had been sold, was moved to New York. And can you imagine? I mean, this was beyond desperate. Financially, he had to pull out everything that he had. And one door that was open to him, very small door, was this book. Old Mother West Wind had been published the year before, 1910. And it was a lark. It wasn't, he was at Phelps Publishing. Someone came in from Little Brown and said, does anybody have any stories? And he said, well, yes, I have a few children's stories. He had written some for his son, and they'd run in Good Housekeeping. So the editor took them along, and Little Brown liked it, asked him to write a few more, and he published that collection as Old Mother West Wind in 2010. And this was one thing in, I said 2010, I meant 19. The next year, the game had completely changed. The next year, any source of income was important. In the first edition of Old Mother West Wind, he sold about 2,000 copies and made a couple $100. But fast forward, anything that he could make from his writing was significant. And he felt that there was a potential. Burgess was writing at the dawn of children's literature. This is another fascinating piece of the Thornton Burgess story, is to realize that children's lit was coming into its own at this time. And the dynamics of it are, if you're interested in children's literature, it's absolutely fascinating. But this book became important to him, and he had success. He had very quick and very steady success. So in 10 years, between 1910 and 1920, Thornton Burgess wrote 45 children's books. He had a column, you see, and in that column, that daily column, he would condense those and pull them together for a book. So it was a good system that he had going, and it enabled him to survive financially. One of his best-known illustrators was Harrison Cady, the gentleman on the left there. Harrison Cady was a very successful illustrator in New York, very popular, very famous. Thornton Burgess was so honored when he was told that Harrison Cady was going to be illustrating some of his books. Harrison Cady was the second illustrator. George Kerr, for those of you who care about things like this, George Kerr illustrated the first four Burgess books. So that's why the look on this that is not, those of you who know Harrison Cady, that is not Harrison Cady's work. But they were great friends, and I have a touching picture to show you at the end. This is the two of them working. This is a typical Harrison Cady picture, and you can see the rabbit is plump. This is Peter Rabbit and Mrs. Peter, plump with clothes. George Kerr was the first one who put clothes on Thornton Burgess's characters. But Burgess always appreciated, he was a very humble person, and he truly appreciated what the illustrators did for his work, and especially Harrison Cady. So I was telling you about the ecosystem and Burgess's superb sense of it. So this illustration shows, gives a demonstration. I think you'll see some insects, or you would anyway if it was a little larger. But we have the mammals, we have the amphibian, we have the birds, and this is typical of the world that Thornton Burgess created. So this may not look like what you associate with Thornton Burgess. However, these illustrations were drawn by Luis Agassiz Fuertes. You may know him as one of the most brilliant ornithological painters of the 20th century. And he illustrated 5 Thornton Burgess books. And I thought, why would this famous man, some people have said he was more brilliant than James Audubon, for example. Why would he be illustrating children's books? And in the writing of this book, I learned not to back away from questions like that. You go get an answer for yourself. So I called Luis Agassiz Fuertes' biographer in Philadelphia and, conversed about things. And then I said, why would Luis Agassiz Fuertes, this brilliant, nationally known, probably internationally known artist, be illustrating children's books? And he said, well, first of all, Luis Agassiz Fuertes authorized every contract. So he would have approved the working with Thornton Burgess. And he said, and also he would have seen Burgess as a peer, as a kindred spirit. Because Burgess was so well respected as a naturalist. He was so well respected for the work he was doing. People got it that he was educating children about nature. And people like Luis Agassiz Fuertes, they understood and they appreciated that aspect of Burgess's work. So this is a picture, Thornton Burgess with Peter Rabbit, and this illustrates sort of a unique problem for me. Yes, when you have Potter people going, well, of course, Thornton Burgess, usurped the Peter Rabbit name, and the Burgess people going, well, Potter, took the name of Peter Rabbit from Thornton Burgess. And I thought, again, I can't back away from this. I have to look into this and see what's the bottom line here. So you all know what I'm talking about, right? Beatrix Potter, Tale of Peter Rabbit, 1901. Thornton Burgess with Old Mother West Wind introducing Peter Rabbit in 1910. Doesn't look very good in terms of possible plagiarism. But again, time and place. In the dawn of children's literature, the rules were different. The first children's bookstore was established in Boston in 1916. The first children's book review was coming out. It was all new. And the circumstances in which Burgess used the name Peter Rabbit, he was writing stories for his son. Interestingly enough, Beatrix Potter was doing the same. Her Peter Rabbit was written for a child, to comfort a child. Burgess's was written to comfort a child. So I've gone into this pretty carefully in Nature's Ambassador. And I consulted a couple experts on children's literature. What did they think? Is this plagiarism? And I have present two different points of view from two children's literary experts. So I think it was a matter of time and place myself. And Burgess was always careful to credit Beatrix Potter with the creation of the name Peter Rabbit. So Burgess's literary career is one thing. Burgess's career as a naturalist is another. And this is the lesser-known piece of Thornton Burgess. This man might not be familiar to you, but he was extremely well known at the turn of the century. This is William Hornaday, who was a fire-breathing conservationist. If he could ram some legislation through Congress and embarrass anti-conservation legislators, it made his day. He loved this. He hung around with the wealthy, with the powerful, with Henry Ford, and this was his milieu. Thornton Burgess respected what William Hornaday was trying to do when he got in touch with him. And at first, Hornaday said, "Sorry, too busy." But Thornton Burgess had occasion to write a letter and explain the size, the magnitude of his popularity. In Kansas City, they established some Peter Rabbit clubs. And within weeks, there were like 50,000 children signed up within weeks. Thornton Burgess had a power base. And William Hornaday recognized this when he got the facts and figures together and Burgess's offer, "Can I help you?" He said, "Oh yes, you can help me." And he said, what would be great would be if you would write a book explaining the plight of the migratory bird. He was trying to get through the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which some of you may know, just had the 100th anniversary last year. Someone told me this is one of the most powerful pieces of conservation legislation in our country. And Thornton Burgess received from William Hornaday a thank you note saying, when it ultimately passed, he said, "You can share the congratulations. You had a hand in this." I'm wording it badly. But Thornton Burgess was credited because of The Adventures of Poor Mrs. Quack, which laid out very sympathetically from the side of the duck, from the side of the animal, what it was like to be flying, exhausted, coming in. It was a plea for understanding and sympathy, but it was warranted. It was warranted, and it was effective. So Burgess, that was a subtle thing. Actually, Poor Mrs. Quack, if you've read it, maybe wasn't so terribly subtle. But what he was up against, you see the feather here. And so women's fashions were encouraging the use of feathers and fur, and this combined with the market hunting, which encouraged the slaughter of animals in the marketplace in Boston, for example. And this combined with the introduction of cars, and which made areas where wildlife were safe now exposed them, and weaponry changed. The ability of a gun to shoot, say, a hunter could fire into an incoming flock of ducks and not aim at any of them, simply fire, and the scatter shot would, take down who knows how many. So the game changed. And Thornton Burgess, William Hornaday, and others attempted to bring in conservation measures that were going to help protect wildlife. And he always kept in mind the children. Very savvy. He understood. This was the next generation of voters, the children were. So this is a very prestigious, Nature magazine, very prestigious magazine. And if you look at the names, Anna Botsford Comstock, and William and Irene Finley, nationally known photographers. This was a major league publication. And you see, I don't know, Burgess's name is just below. You see Western Field Representative Finley. Just below that is Thornton Burgess, and he's listed not as children's author, as a naturalist. And his article in this very important magazine was using nature. Where is it? I don't see it there. Nature study is the key to knowledge. And Burgess believed that nature, children identified with nature. They got nature. They understood it. They liked it. And so to use nature in the educational process to Thornton Burgess made great sense, and he advocated for using nature in a curriculum from kindergarten through senior high school. Burgess himself was always a student of nature, and one of his dear friends, Alfred Gross, he met through his radio program. Alfred Gross was an ornithologist at Bowdoin College, and he was doing a study on the ruffed grouse and parasites. And Burgess said, well, maybe I can help you out and get some specimens for your study. I'll use my radio program and ask listeners if people can contribute specimens. So it worked wonderfully, and Alfred Gross got hundreds more ruffed grouse specimens than he would have otherwise. And it was the beginning of a friendship. This photograph was taken when Thornton Burgess went with Alfred Gross for 6 weeks in Labrador. It was a survey that Alfred Gross was making, and Burgess was kind of tagging along, but he was an excellent photographer. And having read Thornton Burgess's journals from stem to stern, I feel that his happiest days in his whole life were those 6 weeks that he was in Labrador, where it was cold and it was wet and it was nasty and he was clambering over rocks, and he and Alfred Gross were looking for nests like this, and they were counting birds, and he was in his glory. This was Thornton Burgess's love. He wasn't really the New York literary kind of guy. He was a naturalist. So this is a picture, I think, in Nature's Ambassador. This is a picture I dearly love. I got this about 2 days before I was sending the manuscript off. And this is a very rare picture. There was a conference held at the time that Burgess was in Labrador with Alfred Gross. One of the reasons for going up there was because Alfred Gross was going to be a speaker at a conference in Mattamack. And this was the 1931 Mattamack Conference on Biological Cycles. It was in the middle of nowhere. It had been pulled together by a Boston businessman. This was no corporation. This was no academic thing. This man, Copeland Amory, wanted to know about biological cycles. So he invited the best minds in Europe and in North America to come to his place in Labrador. Let's sit down for a week, all of us guys, and we'll discuss biological cycles. Does this sound contemporary? Are we dealing with this today? He was trying to understand why salmon populations fluxed, waxed, and waned. And so Thornton Burgess is the 6th one there, and Alfred Gross is the 7th one. Burgess is standing back. He didn't feel that he belonged at all. But what was interesting to him was these people all knew him. And they knew him because they'd been reading his stories to their children for years. Thornton Burgess didn't know them, but they knew him. So I'll share with you just a little cute piece of the Mattamack conference. Everyone would be sharing experiences at night. All these people would come together. And Burgess was very shy and didn't feel he belonged there at all. So he kind of kept way to the back. And then finally, it was towards the end of the conference, and someone said, well, Burgess, you haven't had anything to say. Come on, let's have a story. And so he tried to get out of it, and they wouldn't have it. So he said, all right, I'll tell a story, but you have to all pretend that you're little 7-year-old boys, and I'll tell you the story of Buster Bear. And so he did. But I think it's just extraordinary what was accomplished at this conference on biological cycles by a Boston businessman who simply pulled everybody together. This is another piece of Burgess's legacy. Those are Thornton Burgess's hands, and yes, it's a bad picture. The bird in his hands is the last heath hen. This was a species that was declared extinct shortly after this, a few years after this picture was taken. You can see there's a band on its leg. And Alfred Gross had been hired to do a survey of the heath hen. As it came down, the heath hen survived, this species only survived in one place, Martha's Vineyard. At one point, they had been up and down the East Coast, but various factors contributed to their decline. And finally, that's the only place where they existed. And Alfred Gross was hired, and he invited Thornton Burgess to join him in counting, making a survey of this population. And if you're sitting there and you're thinking, how the heck are you going to count birds in nature? How are you going to do that? And it's a very fair question. So some species, like the heath hen, are known to congregate, males and females, at one point for mating, and they congregate in one area, and they always do this. So there was one field in Martha's Vineyard that was known as the booming ground because these birds made a very extraordinary sound. And so the counting got more and more dismal and finally it was down to 12 birds, and then it was 9 birds. And then it was 3 birds. And when the count that Alfred Gross was making with Thornton Burgess was only 3 birds, and they were all male, there was no question that this species was headed to extinction. Then came the year, there was only 1 bird. And on the vineyard, this bird was very beloved. Everyone knew this story very well. And they named the bird Booming Ben. And Thornton Burgess's description, it will just, wrench your heart out in his autobiography of the solitariness, the isolation of this bird, that nowhere on the planet was there one of his kind. And it, again, the opportunity to think things through as a writer, it occurred to me, what Burgess and Alfred Gross did, they decided to capture the heath hen. They wanted to band it. So when the bird died, if the bands were found, it could be identified as the last heath hen. But the situation, when you think about that, which I did, was, is it possible that these 2 men were making a decision, well, we release the bird to the wild, we kill it and we have it stuffed, or, which was a reasonable option, or we turn it over to a zoo, as the passenger pigeon had been kept in a zoo for many, many years. And they decided, rightly in my opinion, to release the bird. But I thought, is that possible? 2 people, the last of its kind, they could decide? So I called Mark Madison at U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the senior historian there, and he said, yes, that is possible in that time, that they had the ability to make that decision, and they did. So they released the bird, and this is a significant picture of an important part of Thornton Burgess's life. So this picture I've included because to me it shows, oh, by the way, Burgess said this was the highlight, this moment, you're looking at what he said was the highlight of his life. He is receiving from Bradford Washburn, on the left, a gold medal award. This was the very end of Burgess's life. Bradford Washburn, you may know, was the director of the Boston Museum of Science. extremely important person. He'd been an important explorer, photographer, long list of his accomplishments from the time he was a young man. And Bradford Washburn at the Boston Museum of Science, they wanted to honor him. And he said, well, all right, that would be very nice, thank you, but I'd also like you to honor the 3 people who have most influenced me. And he took a long time with that. It was quite a list of people who had influenced him. And Curtly Mather at Harvard, his professor, was one. Another one was Gilbert Grosvenor at the National Geographic Society, and Thornton Burgess, children's writer. So Burgess, the influence that he had, to me, this picture speaks it, that someone of Bradford Washburn's caliber would make a point. He and his wife Barbara had driven from Boston to Hamden to personally hand this to Burgess, who was not well. And they Bradford Washburn wanted to make sure that he got it. So the legacy of Thornton Burgess is in his books, his 70 books. I found different figures on the numbers of books, mid-20th century. It's pretty hard to track it down, but anywhere from possibly 7 million to 10 million books, mid-20th century. So books are still being published now. It's an enormous number of books that Thornton Burgess has spread throughout the world. So the Hamden, those who've been to Hamden, you'll remember this. This is Burgess's writing studio, and he wrote thousands of books. This is in Hamden. So the house that he lived in Hamden was quite near the road, a sweet, old-fashioned house. And up on the hill, the Esker, as he called it, behind it, was his writing studio. He'd go up in the morning, write, come down for lunch, go back up, write, come back down. And that was Thornton Burgess's life. This was his dream come true posthumously. You remember I told you about the Japanese cartoon and Ziv International being released around the world in 1979. So it's really interesting. There's Sammy J and Peter Rabbit and Buster. And it's pretty interesting to hear the different languages and also to see the statements that people make on YouTube. One person wrote on YouTube, having listened to you can hear the theme song, and this person said, "Oh, I never thought I'd hear this again outside of Romania." And I'm thinking, Romania? So full circle here. This is Harrison Cady and Thornton Burgess. This is probably within a year or so of the time he died in 1965. But it's a sweet picture to me, and it speaks to the depth of Thornton Burgess's friendships. These two were old friends. They were widowers at this point. Their wives had been part of the friendship. They'd gone on picnics, they'd gone on road trips, they'd had a wonderful time, the 4 of them together. And so these 2 old friends to come together at the Mary Lyon Nursing Home in Hamden. I find this picture very touching, if not professionally expert. And I think this is the legacy, the hearts and the minds of children. As I said, Thornton Burgess didn't go looking for the great American novel. He didn't go looking for the bigger, the splashier audience. It was children. It was always children. And the story is told in this book. This is Nature's Ambassador. This is the full-color version of the Harrison Cady print. Schiffer Publishing wanted this. Christy Lawrence wanted this. I did not win out. It's on the back cover. But I love this picture. This is Thornton Burgess. And you can just feel his enjoyment of nature. He's smelling it. He's watching it. I love that picture. And any writers, these are some of the resources that were useful in putting this book together. And you'll make note of the last one. Your knowledge your curiosity about your subject, your confusion, make use of it. Fear, was I afraid I was writing about a plagiarist? Yeah, I think I was a little bit afraid of that. Instinct and your ambition for the work, these will all serve you. And to close, I doubt if anybody recognizes this person. Oh my gosh, I am blown away. What an impressive audience. What an impressive audience. This is fabulous. Yes, I thought I would end with Nikki Giovanni. The end of the book contains some edited interviews, and I simply couldn't tear them apart to use them in the book. I had to hold them together. And Nikki Giovanni's was one of those glorious interviews. So I'd like to close with reading you what she had to say about why Thornton Burgess was important to her. And a little introduction of her. Nikki Giovanni is a distinguished professor at Virginia Tech who addressed the campus with a poem composed after the horrific 2007 campus shootings. Her 24 books for children and adults have received wide recognition, including the Coretta Scott King Award, Caldecott Honors, and NAACP Image Awards, nominations for the National Book Award, and a Grammy nomination for her spoken word article, The Nikki Giovanni Poetry Collection. Nikki Giovanni participated in the 2009 bicentennial celebration at the Lincoln Memorial by reading her poem, At This Moment. And here's what Nikki Giovanni told me about Thornton Burgess. I guess it was my mother who introduced me to Old Mother West Wind series. I liked the Merry Little Breezes and Old Mother West Wind. Like any mother, she had jobs to do, and she leaves the Merry Little Breezes to play in the meadow while she goes off to send ships sailing and do all the important work mothers have to do. I thought it was wonderful. I always loved that it was a series, that there was another book, another story, and another. I was in 4th grade when I started reading Burgess. I grew up with my grandmother in Knoxville, Tennessee. My parents lived in Cincinnati. It was a rural area, so we had a bookmobile, and I remember a terrible thing happened. I used to like to make bubbles. I was reading The Cave Twins and knocked the bubbles over onto the book. So Mommy had to buy the book. I was feeling so bad. It was probably $2.50. It taught me not to read with bubbles. Granny Fox would have done the same thing my mother did. If Reddy knocked something over, she would have said, "I'm sorry, but you cannot do this." But she wouldn't have tried to humiliate him. At my home, I have a meadow, and I've taken it back to natural Virginia. We pulled out everything that wasn't native, and now the birds can feed all year round. My friend, Alice Walker, has 100 acres, and I have 2 acres, but it is comfortable. It is balanced now. I have a variety of wildlife, field rats, mice, skunks, possums, rabbits. You see them all winter. I never come home without looking at my lawn because they'll be sitting there. I come very slowly. I'm sure I was influenced by Burgess because I think of all these creatures as being my friends. Mother Nature tries to keep a balance. When I was 10, I did see that balance in the stories, and I did see that patience in Granny, that things come when they should. The stories were incredibly important to me. To me, we were contemporaries, me and Reddy. I wasn't thinking, this is the way you treat nature. There was a sense of camaraderie. They, the animal characters, were not different from me, nor were they dangerous. And you delighted in all of that, even the Merry Little Breezes. Somehow they all became real to me. It wasn't, oh, the winds are important, but yes, I'd like to play with the Merry Little Breezes. And I still feel that way. I don't know if I learned that from Burgess or I brought that to Burgess. Human beings are not good neighbors. If more kids read more books like Thornton Burgess, they would probably have more respect. They wouldn't be afraid of differences. If youngsters were reading Old Mother West Wind, they would know that tragedies occur. The life cycle goes on. You cannot defend against everything. What I do know about Granny and Reddy and the Green Meadow is you are always watchful. You use ordinary prudence. That's the price you pay for life. There's an old Negro spiritual that says, watch right and pray, and that's what we all have to do. Watch right means watch correctly. Those are the two things that will get you over things that are get-overable. Some things are not, but you can't spend your whole life being afraid, otherwise you'd need to lock yourself up. Things happen, and that's why you use ordinary prudence. I had a student from England who'd never had grits, so I made them for him. When I got to the campus that morning, it was still dark. And because I work at a university and things happen in big places, I turned my car off and I looked around. I used ordinary prudence. It's a good habit. The books my children grew up with didn't teach them compassion or love or ordinary prudence. I think that Burgess deserves more, and young readers would benefit from reading him. He has not gotten his due. Thank you very much.